Hello, everyone. This is Greg Aden for another episode of Servant Leadership. And today I've got a beautiful guest. And I say that not only as she's beautiful, but if you get to know her and understand her heart, I think you'd agree. She's a very prolific individual, lots of great history and experiences we're going to dive into. But before we get into that, Janine Davis from Los Angeles, how are you doing today?
I am doing well. I started my day off with a nice walk on the beach and saw my favorite dolphin pod. So can't really start better than that. So it's infiltrated my day.
Yeah, I'm jealous that you get the ocean and
Yeah,
we have mountains, you have ocean. But if I could go week to week and alternate, that would be a perfect life.
I know. I'm with you. Can't
Yeah.
quite figure that one out yet, but maybe one day.
Well, yeah, it takes a lot of travel. I know that for sure.
Right.
So tell me, I know you're managing partner evolution. You've been doing that for looks like about 6 years, and you've got all sorts of things in your work history and advisor to this and advisor to that. But give the audience just a quick snapshot of who Janine Davis is.
Maybe I'll start with how I got here. That might
Beautiful.
be helpful. So I'm actually in my third career. I started off in engineering and I was at Accenture working, the perfunctory 80-hour weeks back there in their technology group. And when I had my kids, so I kind of grew up the ranks in tech. I grew up to, be a CTO in technology, but then I had my babies back to back. And if you think it is challenging being a woman in tech now, consider what it was like back then. It was a while ago.
I can imagine.
So it was just a big job. I had a really big job, big crew, and I wanted to see my kids occasionally. So long story, back when I was at Accenture, I'd met this owner of a recruiting agency and stayed in touch with her forever. And she was also an ex-technology person. And I'd always kind of been this like natural matchmaker and gotten people jobs. So I'm like, well, why don't I try that? It's like worst case, if I hate it, I'll get myself a job in tech again, right? So
Sure.
anyway, long story, I spent 20 years in that world, in the world of recruiting, mostly for venture-backed startups. And including I had my own agency for 7 years. And, there was nothing really wrong with the business. It was becoming sort of increasingly more transactional.
Yeah.
And I'm very much the part I liked was the people connection part. So what had happened also kind of concurrently is I got on the board of a thing called Women Founders Network. Ever heard of it?
Yes. Yes, I have actually.
Yeah, so it's like sort of it's basically an organization focused on supporting early stage female founders with less than a million of institutional funding. And so it was, we were doing fast pitches for women way before it was trendy to do it.
Yeah.
So I started doing pro bono coaching of some of the female founders way back. I'm like, okay, this is it. This is the why that I was put on earth. And so for over, kind of probably like 3, 4 years, I got certified as a coach through the Hudson Institute of Coaching. I did both the recruiting and the coaching and sort of
Mm.
juggled a lot for quite a while. And eventually ended up meeting the founders of Evolution through this weird, circumstantial meeting that I had many, many years ago with somebody that knew the founders. And like, hey, do you know these people at Evolution? I'm like, nope.
Mm.
Went to look on their website and it said the tagline at the time said scale without losing your soul. I'm like, okay, those are my
Like
people.
it. Yeah.
And sort of made my way eventually into what I'm doing now full time. So the people piece is the piece that drove me here.
Yeah. And so you do what do you love most about what you're doing? And I hate to say on a day-to-day basis, but when you wake up on Monday morning, what about what you do just lights you up?
I think it's two pieces. One is just in the individual level, being able to really deeply get to know individuals and help them to transgress and progress through whatever they're trying to get through
Hmm.
other place. And then on the broader level, it's just this idea that I think, especially right now, that business can be one of the primary vehicles for change. And
Yeah.
so you can have impact on a leadership team or one single executive, and they in turn can have impact on their organization and the product and their customers. That's what gets me.
Yeah. I love the word impact. When I first started Aiden Leadership, it was impact, influence, and inspire. And I realized inspiration comes from a lot of different ways. So I kind of narrowed it down to influence and impact. And like you, I believe when you focus on the heart of an organization or the heart of a team, which is usually an individual, and that individual has an opportunity to show up in a way that impacts positively or negatively other human beings. And What are some of the things you do when you are making an impact in someone's life? How do you know you've reached them? How do you know that they get it and therefore you feel it for them?
Again, it feels a little different if it's an individual versus a team. So if it's an individual, it's usually just through, realizations that they're having and actual them acknowledging change in their own behaviors and outcomes.
Yeah.
Usually pretty foundational shifts internally. And then on teams, it tends to be more, I mean, it can be metrics based. You can like measure behavior and things like that before and after. But I think it has more to do with if we're doing like leadership development training, for example, and sessions that go over the course of time, the way they're showing up, the level of engagement, the way that they're supporting each other as peers, it just completely shifts. So you can just see it. It's like the wheels are turning,
Yeah.
the impact and how they're interacting with each other.
Well, if someone said, Greg, what do you love most about what you do? And I would say would be facilitating a group or a team and love to see when they get it or when they're working in small groups and they're coming together in ways they couldn't if we didn't have this facilitation.
Exactly.
And I just, that if I could do that every week, I would. It's
Yeah.
just, unfortunate we're not connected to all of our teams in person. There are a lot of my clients, I'm sure like yours, Janine, are spread across the country.
Yeah, they're
But
all oval at this point.
I,
But
I always like to ask my guests this question. If you were sitting in front of a room of, let's say, seniors in college, and they have an idea of what they want to do, they might even have an intern lined up. But if you were talking with them, and specifically around the term leadership,
mm,
what would be a few things that you would want this group of young men and young women to hear so then if they did heed your advice, they would be better leaders a lot sooner than perhaps you and I were
yeah.
when management was the conversation and not leadership. But what would you tell this beautiful group of people?
I think there's a couple of things that pop to mind I would tell the beautiful group of people. Number one is basically basic EQ. So self-awareness, self-regulation. I feel like those are fundamental to everything in leadership, and that the terminology is repackaged and reused by different thought leaders and different books. But it's basically understanding what are the things that set you off reliably. How do you catch it? How do you re-regulate your nervous system? How do you choose how you're going to react going forward versus being reactionary? I feel like that is, if the world learned that, along with how to have a hard conversation and how to breathe, we'd
Hmm.
all be in a better place. We'd be in a better place. So fundamental emotional intelligence. And the other thing, this is actually coming more from my recruiting background as well as my own personal experiences, is to not be so concerned about each decision you make, that you can always change. You can always, I'm literally on my third career. And when I was in recruiting, I'd have these kids in high school and college coming to me saying, I've got to pick the right career. I'm like, no, you don't. Do the right thing right now. And if you don't like it, you'll figure something else out. You're not stuck. And I think that's true for leadership as well. You do the best you can do, and then you learn from it and move forward.
Yeah, love what you said around emotional intelligence and self awareness. It's funny that Tammy and I, my wife, give her a name, Tammy. We always come back to: Are we really aware of what the other person's saying? But
Right.
are we self aware enough to care? And are
Right.
we self aware enough or emotionally intelligent enough to care about asking the next question? And that is the one I love to ask: Is how may I be a better spouse today? How may I be a better friend today? And um, I put on out on LinkedIn a few weeks after I lost my son in May, really encouraging my followers to ask their existing children, "How may I be a better parent today?" And you might just get some information that you've never had before because A, you didn't know how to ask the question, or you thought you were asking it, you just weren't, and you weren't connecting.
Well,
Um,
I have to just say, I'm so sorry to hear about that.
yeah, it's part of it's a part of who I am, and if I could change things, I would. But mental health and mental illness and being adopted and growing up in two different households and um, yeah, he decided he didn't want to be here anymore, and it's something I live with every day. And but I'm better for having Sam Jackson Gregory Aden in my life, and he's the little guy I referenced earlier on before we got started. We adopted him from Russia,
Wow.
and was just a beautiful soul. And the world was a better place for him to be here for 14 years.
I'm really sorry to hear that though. And also appreciate you naming mental health. That's actually something I'm passionate about. I've got complex PTSD. I'm very vocal about things like that because I really feel it allows people to talk about it.
Yeah. I mean, it's a real thing. And just because you don't have someone who's battling it or having a difficult time, medicine isn't the answer. It's the environment that we create for them and with them. And as parents, unless you're asking what these little people want and need, now you don't have to appease them. And again, I'll just go out on a little tangent here. When I ask people to be better leaders and more interested and more committed leaders, I don't mean do everyone else's job.
Right.
And nor am I suggesting parents coddle them, because I honestly believe the more you coddle, the less powerful they're going to be as a leader down the road. And they're just going to expect people to do something for them. And back to your conversation with the college students, do what's right now. And I believe what you meant is do the very best you can in the position that you've selected. And if it doesn't work out, obviously, split amicably and move on. And a lot of people call that impatience. And we can have another conversation around a generation who might be labeled impatient. I look at it as if they're communicating openly and it's not working out, what else could you ask a person to do?
And
You
I
know,
think a level of patience is different, even regardless of generation. I know people that are supposedly in the very impatient generation that will stick it out for a very long time and others that won't. So, I don't know if there's a right or wrong answer there. It's just personal thing.
yeah. I mean, there's a lot of people who put up with stuff that they shouldn't be asked to be, put up with. They do it because they call it, well, I'm loyal.
Right.
Loyalty is great, but it's got to be put in the right context.
Also,
Um,
I mean, I'm going back to EQ. EQ is most likely at the root of that, so it's like there's a decision to stay somewhere which is based in groundedness, and there's a decision to stay somewhere that's based in reaction to whatever the thing is.
Yeah. Speaking of reaction, I host or I provide a webinar called Courageous Conversations, and you called it Have a Hard Conversation or Difficult Conversation. It's all the same, but it's based on, are you willing to make the shifts to be a better communicator, a better listener, and with your eyes too? Do you have the empathy and the curiosity to ask the questions to the people that you're actually communicating with? And I like to say, the ones you say you love, or the ones you've hired, or the ones you say you enjoy working with,
Yeah.
really see you as someone that gives a blank. And I also help them with giving them tools, and one of them is understanding your triggers.
Yeah.
And you said breathe, and I can't tell you how many times I've shared with people,
Mm.
just pause, don't get triggered, and even if you are, it's okay, but be aware that you are. Take a breath, ask for 1 second or a minute or another time, and literally walk away and get yourself back together. And if the other person still wants to attack you, guess what? I don't have any interest in having a conversation with Janine, and just keep it simple and walk away. Now, people will say, well, they're my boss and they're yelling at me. I have to. No, you don't have to. Anybody that's pointing a finger at you, using bad language or yelling at you, you have every right to just say, I need to come back and have this conversation another time.
Yep.
Would you agree?
Well, I totally agree. I think there's I don't know if you know that the CIA model. Have you ever heard of that model? The
I don't believe so. No.
control, influence, adapt. It's really useful, especially if you feel stuck, and it's basically giving agency, which I think is what you're talking about. In any situation, you have agency. And the idea is, in certain situations, you can or can't control things. And then you might, depending on that, be able to influence things. But if not, you still have the option of accepting or adapting or not. And the or not is always the option. It's like, I'm not willing to do this. And it puts you in a state of agency.
And I love there's a distinction. Stephen Chandler made it famous years and years ago. He has a beautiful audio. He's got an interesting voice and easy to listen to. But he really basically says, seek agreement.
Mm.
Seek agreement and let expectations lie where they belong, and that's really nowhere. If I expect something of you, you can say, okay, And then later you can not do it, and then my expectations weren't met. Or you do it and my expectation, or if you don't do it, my expectations weren't met. One or the other. It's either yes you did or no you didn't. But agreement says I will. And when you ask somebody to do something and they say they will, now you have two invested parties. And I just call that good leadership and great parenting. And it's funny because my 12-year-old son, Brooks, understands that.
Nice.
Hey,
That's
bud, do we have an agreement? Yes. So you will be downstairs in 15 minutes? Yes. I mean, the little things. What's wrong with getting them to understand what honoring your word is? And oh, by the way, I hope you would agree, integrity is probably one of the biggest, most important leadership principles out there.
is that if it's not there, walking out the door. But I think what you're also pointing out is the importance of being very clear about what you're asking a person to agree to, which I think
Absolutely.
skip a lot. And then that's, I think, why people say yes and they think they have an agreement, but they actually don't because there's lack of clarity about what you're agreeing to.
Hmm. And the conversation or the communication then allows us to spend extra time in making sure what you and I are agreeing to is clear. Again, comes back with to empathy and curiosity and the desire, not the have to, the get to. I call leadership a privilege and it's honor to lead, and it's nothing you have to do. Well, yeah, I was promoted. Well, you were promoted to lead people, not just lead process. So,
True. Curious, have
uh,
you been have ever coached people that have gotten into leadership positions, or let's say they're in a scaling company. So when they started, they were really doing, but now they're leading and they don't want to anymore. Have you coached people through that?
well, they yes, I have. And I would say that some of them are really good at asking for help,
Mhm.
which, in my opinion, is one of the hardest things leaders do, especially men. They don't like to raise their hand and say, hey, I'm unsure, I need help. And again, no one raises their hand and just says, I need help. But again, your offer, your ask is that I don't know everything and I'd like for us to communicate. Someone that just does everything and now they're responsible for leading human beings, unless we provide them coaching, it's going to be unclear as to how they're supposed to behave. But where I see the challenge, Janine, to answer your question specifically, is a doer becomes in a leadership position, but they're called a supervisor or manager, and they're treated like a supervisor or manager, and no one helps them become a leader.
Yeah, right.
So to the organizations that listen to this podcast, they would never misunderstand what I mean by you lead people and you manage process.
Right.
But if you're promoting people who only believe in process
Yeah,
and not people,
right.
again, it's pretty easy for me. People over process, people over profit. You'll
Yeah,
get the process, you'll get the profit, but you can't do it without people.
totally agree.
Yeah. And a lot of people don't get that, and they don't realize because they're just so impacted on I got to get this done. Got to get this done. But at what level of frustration with your relationships?
Yeah, I mean, there tends to be great short-term results if you do it that way, but the long-term impact is never what you want, rarely what you want, maybe once in a blue moon, but it always comes out in the wash.
Yeah. And the synergy that you can create by being self aware and demonstrating that this behavior as a leader is healthy and it's going to help our team grow. And so, how can I, as a leader, he or she says, can I help you become more self aware? Do they know about PQ or EQ, or do they even understand the basics of just listening and asking better questions? But
Right.
if you're around leaders who believe they know it all and they behave in a way, then they're arrogant or egotistical or narcissistic, all the other fun words that some of our great leaders in this country have. But we
Mhm.
just follow them because they're what? Cool? They make a lot of money? Why do
Fear.
we do it?
Mm,
Fear?
I think there's a lot of reasons. I think fear is definitely what prevents people from asking questions if you have a person like that leading.
Yeah.
What that does, that leads to lack of clarity, and then you don't get the results you want. So it's just like this endless cycle.
Well, where I stop and break the cycle with all um, seriousness is I point to the leader. Because
Mhm.
if you're afraid to ask questions, if you're afraid to be vulnerable, I don't mean demonstrate your intimacy with everybody. I'm just saying be vulnerable to say, hey, I'm not sure. Hey, gang, what do you believe we should do? Doesn't mean they're going to tell you what to do, But now you're showing an interest to ask questions. That behavior then is going to be something that they continue to do. They feel safe to do it. And before you know it, we're all communicating at a much higher level. And I'm just going to go out on them and say you probably are coaching organizations that are on their way up, and they maybe have been stuck at some point. And so with that, what are some of the things, without giving names and trade secrets, of course, but when you work with a team that, like you said earlier, they get it, they light up, what are they really getting? What are they really shifting?
God, let me think if I can break it down to specifics. Because it feels like it's so different in every organization. But I really think fundamentally, I don't know. I think it goes back to that EQ, just a basic understanding of who each individual is, and that each of us comes into dynamics with our own view of life and our own history, and gaining respect and compassion for that, and being able to
Mm.
productively have conversations, knowing that. And I think that, in organizations where I've seen teams become vulnerable, and I know a lot about, I got trained by Brene Brown on that. So I talked about
Beautiful.
vulnerability for a long time, but if you can bring in, actual vulnerability as she defines it, and then have compassion towards each other, it can just grow relationships and communication. So I think that's fundamentally what it is. It's sort of a balancing respect for each individual, and also a goal towards the team and the whole working as best as it can. I
Sure.
think that's what I got.
Well, if a team is struggling with compassion, respect, vulnerability, and let's not blame the leader on this one. Let's go deeper. Do you where do you believe we learn vulnerability, respect, compassion, empathy, humility? Where do we learn that initially?
I mean, you learn your relationship with it initially very early in life. It's through your parents. I mean, we all have a relationship with all of those things, whether they're positive or negative relationships.
Yeah.
And so I think,
And I'd love for you to say that again, because I have for years said there's such a beautiful and critical or an important connection between leadership and parenting.
yeah,
It's
and being a child, I think that fundamentally, who you are is how you lead.
Mhm.
So who you are and how you grew up fundamentally set all of the sort of the defaults for how you communicate and how you relate to other people and how you react to things. And through building self-awareness, you can either continue to, do the old things, or you can choose to do new things. And as parents, we have an ultimate, I mean, I'm a parent too,
Yeah.
responsibility for modeling healthy dynamics with your children. But the other thing, I don't know if you agree with this, I sort of joke with my kids sometimes, like, no matter our best efforts, you're going to mess your kids up. Like, no matter how hard you try, something's going to happen that you're not going to think is going to be a thing for them, and it becomes a thing for them. But I think what's ultimately important is that you talk to them about it and you work through it with them. And like you said, you're always showing curiosity. And, just like in everything, how can I do better? How can we do better in a relationship?
Well, I want to comment on what you said. No matter what we do, we are going to, or I see, I may have a possibility of messing up my kids. And if we believe that is true, and I do, because we know they're going to have outside influences,
Yeah.
teachers, friends, cousins, I mean, bad bosses, and a tasty freeze, whatever. But we're ultimately the person who gets to ask them, how you doing?
Sure.
Where's your happiness coming from? Where's your joy coming from? And if we do that every other year, it's never going to go well. It's got to be a constant, excuse me, it gets to be a constant conversation with the people you created, we created. And that's an opportunity that I believe is
Yes.
being missed. Unfortunately, I believe that to be true. And this little thing called the phone and little things called iPads and gaming is taking so much time away from these relationships. And again, guilty or not, I just want our listeners to ask themselves, what could you do? What's one thing you could do to be a more engaged parent? And again, I don't mean pleasing and appeasing, but just more engaging in a real way, so then they can grow up and get these real communication skills and carry them on into their other relationships. And frankly, I believe if you are teaching them healthy boundaries and healthy relationship opportunities and how to communicate productively, they may choose people who also want to talk to with them and to them better. And that might reduce bad friends. I don't know. I'm not a psychologist.
Oh, one
I
would
just
have, or at least if nothing else, they'd be more aware of it. They could at least see it maybe and make choices around it more easily versus just this feels great when it actually probably isn't.
no. You said the word model earlier, and anybody I ask in a big group or small group or even one on one, what is the most important leadership trait, or what do you consider to be a valuable leadership trait? And always in the top three, Janine, it's lead by example.
Yeah,
And it's the same thing, parent by example.
totally.
And do you remember this growing up? You didn't. You're younger than I am. But my dad at times would say, "Don't do as I say. I mean, don't do as I do. Do as I say." And I thought to myself, I don't know, probably 5 years ago, that's the most ridiculous thing we can tell a kid. And my dad's passed away, and I'm sure if he's listening now, he'd probably be scratching his head and go, "You know what? It didn't make sense."
Right?
But how can you ask someone to ignore how we're behaving, but I expect you to behave in a way I'm telling you to behave? Just
I know. Sense. But I think we've both probably seen that many times in the work we do.
yeah.
I even feel like in terms of coaching, as coaches, some coaches I know, just don't really do a lot of self development work or the work on themselves. I'm like, I kind of feel like you can't really expect your clients to go there if you're not willing to go there.
No, we talked again off camera when I was on Mount Aconcagua back in January of 2011. It took me a while to really fully pull my head out, if you know what I mean. And when I did recognize what it was like not to hear the best version of myself or see the best version of myself, because imagine what you can't see and can't say when you have your head, you know where.
Yep.
Um, yeah, I did a lot of work, and I also decided that I don't want to be the bad version of my dad. I don't want to be the bad version of my mom, but I do want to carry on the things that I love and admire about both people. And that was the first real piece of work I did, Janine, was to decide who am I going to be
Yeah.
and who am I going to be remembered by. And I realized too that being recognized as the world's greatest Holiday Inn or IHG or hotel franchise guy wasn't going
Yeah.
to ever be on my tombstone.
Yep.
And I made a decision in 2014 that I all I wanted was my boys to say at my death, "Dad inspired us."
Nice.
And if I could get that inscribed on my little piece of stone or my box with my ashes in it, I would have arrived. So
Right.
anyway, what do you, and I wrote this down before we even got on camera, is how will you be remembered? What will the world be saying about Janine Davis when your days are ended?
Well, I think my sort of entire life has led me to the point now where my particular passion, like I do all the normal stuff like one-on-one coaching and leadership development and offsites, but my passion is specifically taking leaders into nature, working with animals.
Hmm.
And especially, do you know the Center for Humane Technology? Have you heard of them?
I have heard of them. Yes.
So they're a client of ours, and we get some interesting access to interesting information and maybe
Sure.
a little bit too much about AI. And I feel I have this distinct sense that the more I know there's amazing uses of AI. I'm not an anti-AI person, but I think
Right.
specifically around deep fakes, I think it's going to become quite destabilizing to people. And
Mm,
I genuinely believe that literally touching nature, like being in nature, is going to be mandatory, not just like, oh, that's going to be great. I think it's going to be something people need to sort of anchor.
yeah.
So that's a piece of the reason I'm very passionate about it. But the other piece is I just have seen such enormous transformation. It I've taken some interesting neuroscience courses, and I think it actually allows access to different ways of thinking, if you want to call it that, because
Sure.
it's out of the ordinary. So it's sort of it accelerates transformation. So that's kind of like my thing. So if I were to be known for doing anything special in the world, it would be that because I just see such incredible impact from it.
Yeah. I've seen it. I've done some equine therapy myself and been to that. I don't coach it. I've been involved, and it is
Amazing.
amazing. It really is.
I also do, so I do the equine stuff, but I also do a program with wolves, which is
Hmm.
amazing. They have extraordinarily healthy team dynamics, not to mention their presence. They are present, they don't work at it.
Yeah.
I also am doing a program I'm super excited about next summer in Kenya. And similarly, drawing the wisdom of how animals interact with each other and sort of how that parlays into leadership and team dynamic stuff.
For someone listening and hearing you say, I work with animals to foster transformation and self awareness,
Mhm.
how does one get wrap their head around it and think of, all right, well, sounds interesting. How do I do it? I would think their why has to be pretty enormous for them to even want to understand the benefits, don't you?
Well, I don't, but I look at it from my viewpoint. I'm like, if I'm going to develop as a leader and I can do it with animals, why would I not do that?
Mm,
it's just like that's just like the best of all worlds to be able to be outside and be in nature and also grow.
absolutely.
I
Yeah.
don't, but that, again, maybe you do because you asked the question. Do you view it as more of a hard, like, why would I do that?
Well, I would love to because, but again, I've seen the benefits and I understand the power and the beauty and the insight that horses do. For instance, I never heard of working with wolves, and I have to admit, as soon as you said wolves, I'm thinking, well, how do you get close to wolves in order to even work with them? And I'm sure there's a safe way of doing all that, and I would love to talk to you more off camera. But
Yeah.
um, my why is never going to get answered. I don't really understand why I'm here yet, but
Ah,
I know that if I can continue to grow each and every day in a small way, then I will get even closer to the answer. And I'm sure one day it'll hit me even more than it did in 2014. But almost doing this for almost 10 years now, I can't think of doing anything more impactful for other human beings.
you know,
And I know I'm on this earth to serve others. And that's why I mentioned servant leadership will be what I'm remembered for outside of my kids. But even then, I'm serving them as a leader every single day I can.
right. Yeah, same. I mean,
Yeah.
that's a piece of it. I was thinking of the question more from the work angle, but in terms of the life angle, it's like that I was a good mom, just plain and simple, that I
Yeah.
did to do as a mom with them.
Yeah. Well, Janine Davis, what would you like to leave our audience with as a parting words of wisdom, or just something you'd like to share to the world?
Just on the theme of nature, I think especially as we're heading into the holidays and at least in the US, got a big election year coming up and we still have a lot going on in the world globally. Breathe.
Mhm.
Go outside for 5 minutes and feel the air and take a breath.
Beautiful. And I hear when you say that to slow down. Yeah. Just
Slow down.
just be.
Exactly.
Love it. Well, again, Janine Davis from Los Angeles, thank you for making time for me and taking a flyer on what it might be like to have an experience like this. So I appreciate your confidence in wanting to be here on the Servant Leadership Podcast. So with that, I would say go out and like I always say, be kind, but as Janine had said earlier, live your life with compassion, respect, and vulnerability for others, and just breathe.
Yes. Thank you for
Great to
having
see you. Thank you very much.
me.
We'll see you next time when I have another exciting guest. But again, stay tuned for another episode of Servant Leadership. And again, this is Greg Aden. God bless.